All right, today we're going to be talking about the cognitive, social, and emotional development in adolescence. Um, Again, these adolescent quotes are some of my favorite. Um, they say it better than anybody else. Here's one. I don't think adults understand how much kids think today. We just don't take something at face value. We want to understand why things are the way they are and the reasons behind things. We want it to be a better world, and we're thinking all the time about how to make it that way. When we get to be adults, we will make the world better. I think that's great, and I hope so. Um, so the term adolescence was first described by G. Stanley Hall in 1904. He described this as a stage of life that was defined by storm and stress. And what did he mean by storm and stress? Intense moodiness, emotional sensitivity, and risk-taking tendencies. And this was recognized, adolescence was recognized as a distinct stage of life in the 20th century when going to high school became routine. So in terms of the history of adolescence, approximately 100 years ago, most children left school after 6th or 7th grade to go find jobs. By 1939, 75% of all U.S. teens were attending high school. The Great Depression limited jobs, leaving young people with no direction. And so the Roosevelt administration implemented a program to encourage young people to attend school. This program was a success, and now we have kids, high schoolers or adolescents going to high school, and then, as you know, on to college very often, and even on to graduate school. Development of adolescent stage, here are some of the characteristics. Due to increased high school attendance, intellectual skills of adolescents have increased. And with the recognition of teens as a lucrative market, businesses began targeting the group, thus helping to develop the adolescent culture. And adolescent culture is typically a culture that rejects conventional rules. And every cohort that goes through adolescence does their own job of rejecting whatever the conventions are. All right, the mysterious teenage mind. So the mind is changing quite a lot during adolescence, and we're going to talk about 3 classic theories of teenage thinking. We'll talk about Piaget, Kohlberg's stages of moral development, and adolescent egocentrism. So we're going to finish with Piaget's stages of cognitive development. We've worked through his stages through the entire semester. And we're finally at the stage of what Piaget called formal operations. So this is the final stage of cognitive growth, beginning at age 12. And this is when Piaget believed that adolescents can think logically about concepts and hypothetical possibilities. And they can think abstractly about ideas and begin to reason. And so this kind of shift from concrete operations to formal operations. Remember, we had pre-operational, where the children couldn't understand conservation, things like that. Then we moved to concrete operational stage. So in math, they would work with real numbers. They could do this multiplication problem. But when we move into formal operations, they can work with unreal numbers. They can do things with variables, letters that stand for something else. That's a more complex type of cognitive ability. In the concrete operational stage in social studies, they might study other cultures by what they do in daily life, how they get food, fishing, etc. Social studies in the formal operational stage, so in adolescence, may start to consider the effect of the gross national product and total fertility rates on global politics. You can see a more abstract kind of concept. In science, in concrete operations, they may grow carrots to see how that works, or feed animals, things like that. Whereas in the formal operational stage, they may study invisible particles and distant galaxies. Again, a more abstract, more highly conceptual type of cognitive ability. In this stage, adolescents have the ability to comprehend higher order abstract logic. They can talk about politics, philosophy, religion, morality, proverbs, metaphors, analogies. Again, just this more complex thinking. Let's go ahead and watch this video of the formal operational stage and showing the difference between or in deductive reasoning in these different stages.
It says, if you hit a glass with a hammer, the glass will break.
I knew that.
And then this one says, Dawn hit a glass with a hammer.
I knew that too.
So what happened to the glass?
It broke
It broke. Why did it break?
because the hammer's hard.
If you hit a glass with a feather, the glass will break.
No, it won't.
And this is the second rule. Dawn hit a glass with a feather. What happened to the glass?
Nothing.
Nothing happened. Why didn't anything happen?
Because the feather's soft.
First one says, if you hit a glass with a feather, the glass will break. And the second one, Dawn hit a glass with a feather. What happened to the glass?
It broke.
And why did it break?
Because the rule says if you hit a glass with a feather, it'll break. So if you hit a glass with a feather, it broke.
All right. So you can see that the child was not able to understand these hypothetical kinds of concepts, whereas by the time you reach the formal operational stage, you can use logic and hypothetical reasoning, even if it doesn't make sense. All right, so one other way we test for abstraction is by proverbs and the ability to understand proverbs, which are by definition abstract. I put these in here just because they were a lot of fun when you asked a child to complete the proverb if they hadn't heard it before. So this is just for fun. If you can't stand the heat, get a pool. A watched pot never disappears. People in glass houses shouldn't run around naked. Now, I think that's very good advice. Strike while the bug is close. And a penny saved is not much. Now, when we're testing for abstract reasoning and doing a test of proverbs, we would say that actual proverb, so people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Maybe you've heard that one before. And if you ask a child what that means, they'll say, well, if you live in a glass house, you really shouldn't throw a stone because the windows will break. They're very concrete in their explanation. By the time they're in the formal operational stage, they're able to explain the abstract meaning of these proverbs and not stick to the absolute concrete definition of the words in the proverb themselves. So, reaching the formal operation stage means the ability to think hypothetically and scientifically, debate no matter what your personal beliefs are. You can take the other side of a debate, attempt to articulate personal wishes strongly. Not all adolescents reach the formal operation stage. It is not a universal stage in Piaget's perspective, and it occurs mainly in Western cultures. All right, moving on to adolescent egocentrism. This is the idea of a heightened self-consciousness during adolescence and the belief that others are as interested in them as they are of themselves. Maybe you can remember back to middle school and high school, and that you thought everybody was looking at you. Maybe you don't want to walk around the mall with your parent because you think other people are looking at you, or if you have a zit on your face, you think the whole entire school notices it, that everybody is really interested in you. And that's just not true. But adolescents have this belief that kind of the whole world is focused on them, which is the idea of the imaginary audience, that the belief that everyone is watching and that their behavior is the focus of others' concern. And as you might imagine, in a large high school, people are doing whatever they're doing, and really nobody's paying attention to anybody else's behavior, but that adolescent themselves feels as though everybody is watching them. It's the imaginary audience. This also goes along with personal fable that adolescents believe that their own experiences are unique, that no one has ever experienced what they're experiencing right now, that nobody could understand them because they're really the only ones who have ever gone through this, and that nothing bad can happen to them because they are special. And this might lead to risky behavior because if you believe nothing bad can happen to you, you're more likely to do risky things. We see this particularly in males. Studying three aspects of this time of storm and stress. Are adolescents more socially sensitive? Yes, they are. Research indicates that in emotionally charged situations, teens become more vulnerable to negative peer pressure. They are more sensitive. There's a tendency for immediate gratification in adolescence over future rewards. We saw this in toddlerhood, that toddlers are really motivated by instant gratification, and over childhood, they're more able to kind of regulate those emotions and get better at delaying gratification. Adolescents are, again, kind of revert back to immediate gratification, particularly when they're around peers. Much of this has to do with the adolescent brain and its development. The prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobes, this is called the executive area of the brain, but it's not at peak performance until young adulthood. So into your 20s, it's still developing. The frontal lobes are still developing. And the frontal lobes, like we have talked about, are the part of the brain that allows you to make good choices, think about consequences, plan your actions. So that part of the brain is not working well still in adolescence. In the meantime, the ventral striatum region makes teenagers extra sensitive to rewards, to feeling good, right? And so getting praise from friends, things like that. While the less active amygdala region leaves them less sensitive to punishment. So punishment and consequences don't mean as much. And so you've got a brain that is not able to really think about consequences, make choices based on good planning and decision making, a brain that's not very sensitive to emotional consequences and extra sensitive to reward. And that leads to very often risky behavior in teens. Here's some interesting new research on this topic.
Driving is probably one of the most complex and also probably one of the most dangerous tasks that we do on a daily basis. In 2015, we saw the largest increase in fatal crashes than we have in the last 50 years. And we know that distracted driving played a pretty significant role in that bump.
Okay, Kenzel, we're gonna have you start. So go ahead and turn the car on and then go ahead and begin driving.
Here in the Drive Sim Lab, we're particularly interested in adolescents and young adults. We want our kids to be safe on the roadway. And motor vehicle crashes are the leading cause of death for teens and young adults through age 24.
I'm gonna put this over.
Here, what we're focused on is really making younger drivers safer sooner through research.
So the first time, actually, that Dr. Vaca and I met, he was very interested in developmental questions and how adolescents make decisions and why they make certain decisions that look so risky from the outside. And then we started realizing that the only way we could actually study how moment to moment changes in brain function influence decision making was truly to have them in a car where we could image their brain.
So we're using dense array EEG, number one. Number two, we use full immersion, high fidelity driving simulation. And number three, we want to look at the eye patterns and the gaze patterns that drivers use while they're driving.
Yeah, so we put the glasses on after we put the net on, and these are Tobii eye tracking glasses. And so the technology.
What's really cutting edge is integrating all three of the facets that we're really using all at once.
Oftentimes people study the brain and then they try to make predictions in the real world. Here we're coming together where this is the real world. We have what looks to be a car that is essentially, it's a real car. It's been set up so that it provides a real experience with immersion, a screen in front, a screen in the back for the rearview mirror.
When I can put them in a challenging, a dangerous situation, how are they going to react? What's the brain doing at that point in time?
Oh my gosh.
So for instance, driving too closely, we can study that, and we can look at how drifting their attention away from the road impacts their driving behavior. And we think this has lots of implications for things like someone talking to you while you're driving, the phone ringing while you're driving. So a lot of people think and believe that they can text and talk on the phone, etc., and it doesn't impact their driving. But we're finding that it does in a very dramatic way.
You've got no more than 2 to 3 seconds to have your eyes off the roadway before you get yourself in big trouble.
So we're really hoping to use this kind of simulation center to look at how decision-making in the brain impacts what adolescents do in the car.
You know, is there something we can do to help teach the young drivers, this young developing brain, how to be a safer driver sooner?
Very important research. And again, you think about this brain that is not developed and putting 16-year-olds in the car, you can see how it can lead to dangerous consequences. So here we go, our adolescents risk takers. And again, the answer is yes. Research shows that 1 in 6 teens had been arrested by age 18. By 23, the arrest rate is 1 in 3. So teenagers are apt to make risky decisions that can land them in trouble. Research indicates most U.S. high school seniors reported having sampled alcohol. 2 in 10 report binge drinking, which is 5 or more drinks at one time. So adolescence is a time for experimenting and taking risks. To talk for a few minutes about drug use and abuse, most teens try psychoactive drugs. It can be cigarettes, alcohol, prescription medicines, cocaine, heroin. Adolescence is a sensitive time for experimentation, which may lead to addiction, and that's key. Most adolescents experiment, but don't go on to addiction. All right. Drug use increases every year from age 10 to 21. So we have more and more experimentation. But again, the experimentation, just because a parent, a caregiver, finds out their child has been, or adolescent has been experimenting with alcohol, doesn't mean that child is going to become an alcoholic. Most children and most adolescents experiment without this leading to long-term significant issues in their life. There's a different pattern for inhalants. That's inhaling fumes from aerosol containers, glue, cleaning fluid. The youngest adolescents are more likely to try inhalants, and inhalants are extremely dangerous. The risk of one-time use leading to brain damage or death is very, very high. So this is where we have the youngest adolescents trying inhalants and it leading to really dangerous consequences in some cases. What about this? Are adolescents more emotional, more emotionally disturbed, or both? Adolescents, and the answer is yes. Sorry. And no. Adolescents live life on an intense emotional plane. Like I said, they switch from feelings of happiness to depression more often than adults. But they're not irrational. They're not emotionally disturbed. They have so many things going on in an adolescent's life. Stresses and pressures from parents, peers, school, future career, so much happening. And so this intense emotionality actually makes sense. However, most teens are typically confident, hopeful about the future. Even with this intense kind of changing of emotions, overall, most adolescents go through adolescence really just fine. Only about 6% report feeling overwhelmed by life. Depression rates do increase at this time. 1 in 5 girls, 1 in 10 boys. We do see some non-suicidal self-injury to cope with distress. Suicidal ideation, which is thinking about killing oneself, is relatively common, just these sort of general fleeting thoughts, but completed suicide is not common at all. And then risk-taking propensities make late teens kind of the peak crime years. You've got adolescents who have frontal lobe still not developed, but yet by the late teens, they have potentially driving, have access to a car, are physically mature, are strong, are spending time with friends, which increases risky behavior. And so that really becomes sort of this peak risk-taking time. All right, what about adolescent identity? Who am I? And here's another quote. 13 is a hard age. A lot of people say you have it easy, you're a kid, but there's a lot of pressure being 13. To be respected by people in school, to be liked, always feeling like you have to be good. There's pressure to do drugs too, so you try not to succumb to that, but you don't want to be made fun of, so you have to look cool, you got to wear the right shoes, the right clothes. Right? It is hard to be 13, to go through adolescence and really figure out who you are. And when we talk about identity, there's been research on this idea that identity can fall kind of into these two continuum of exploration. Are you exploring different identities, meaning that exploration is present, or are you not exploring different identities, meaning it's absent? And commitment, are you committed to a certain identity or not committed? Okay, and if you have these two different continuum, again, it gives us 4 kind of choices for where someone is in their formation of identity. So if commitment is absent, you're not exploring, let's say exploration is absent and commitment is absent. You're not exploring anything, and you're not committed to anything. People ask you, what are you going to do when you get older? And you're like, I don't know, I don't really care, I'm not really thinking about it. This is identity diffusion. If exploration is present, you're kind of trying to figure out who you are, you're trying lots of different things, and you're not committed to anything. This is this moratorium where you're just exploring different options, not committed to any of them. Now, if exploration is absent, you're not exploring anything, but you are committed. This is identity foreclosure. This is the idea maybe your family owns a family business and you say, well, what are you going to do when you grow up? Well, I'm going to go into the family business. Have you thought about anything else? Nope. I just know this is what I'm going to do. And then if you have if you're exploring options and are committed, you have kind of come up with your identity achievement. This is where you're committed to whatever it is that you have explored. Autonomy is another big aspect of adolescence, and this change from being a child and being dependent on parents to being independent. So there's a lot of change in the parent-child relationship. Starting in the early teens, where teens are secretive and maybe distant from their parents. And then in mid-adolescence, there is more autonomy granted by the parents. Again, we're using parents in a very broad term. And then by high school graduation, really the shift from rebelling and trying to get your autonomy to now you are an adult and you're moving to construct your own adult life. Peer groups in adolescence, there are changes in peer groups that happen. There's a sharp increase during adolescence in the time spent with peers versus adults. Nearly half the people a teen names as being important in his or her life are the same age as the teen. So friends become much more important, as opposed to in childhood when adults are extremely important. Peer groups begin to function much more often without adult supervision. And there's more contact with peers that are of the opposite sex. And then we get into cliques and crowds. What are cliques and crowds? Cliques are small groups defined by common activity or simply by friendship, having known each other for a long time. They become a clique. These, you probably, if you remember your high school, you go, oh, there's a clique, a group of people that always hang out together. Whereas a crowd is a larger, more vaguely defined group that's really based on reputation. So who are the jocks in the school? Who are the nerds? Who are the druggies, etc.? There's kind of these larger groups. You could think about what crowd would you say, or would your high school classmates said you belong to, if you could think back to that time. And crowds really do serve a purpose. Teens gravitate toward the crowd that fits their interests and disengage from a crowd when its interest is different from their own. And so when you have very distinctive crowds, the goths, the brains, it kind of can be a vehicle for helping teens find their own kind in a very large school, right? You're going to a large high school, you're trying to see where you fit in. You can say, these people are similar to me. I kind of fit with this group. And if you can't find a group, a crowd, isolation from that crowd may lead to unhappiness and depression. Popularity in adolescence, it's their personal qualities that are very important in determining popularity. Popular students are high in emotional intelligence. They understand how to relate to people. They're enjoyable to be around, typically friendly, cheerful, smart, with a good sense of humor. Less than positive qualities that are associated with popularity. We see popular students are more likely to lie most effectively. Not a great characteristic, but nonetheless correlated with popularity. And culture plays a large role in determining what qualities are associated with popularity. For example, extroversion is valued in Western cultures, but not in every culture. And as adolescence goes on, if you think maybe like through middle school to the end of high school, the structure of cliques and crowds change. Crowds become more permeable and less hierarchical. And so earlier in adolescence, you're kind of stuck with your group and other groups don't want to let you in, and you kind of seen as, part of whatever crowd you associate with. And then by the time we're getting into later adolescence, there's more freedom to change crowds. People are more accepting of people just for being people and not for the crowd they belong to. And so there's a lot more freedom and movement between different crowds. Peer pressure is an absolute force that is happening during adolescence. Young adolescents conform more to peer standards than children do. And this peaks around 8th or 9th grade. Between 14 and 18 years of age, it's important for adolescents to develop the ability to stand up for what one believes in and start to resist peer pressure. Adolescents that are most likely to conform to peers, those who are uncertain about their social identity, and conformity increases when they are in the presence of someone who they perceive to have a higher status than they do. More likely to then do what that person asked them to do, even if they may know it's wrong. All right, let's watch another little video here on the power of peers.
are very strong stereotypes of adolescence, often quite negative stereotypes. You see them in the media now. You also see them back in Shakespeare and even in Plato and Aristotle. These stereotypes of adolescents being badly behaved, making silly decisions, taking lots of risks.
Lazy,
irresponsible,
antisocial, rude, disrespectful,
high maintenance.
Those stereotypes are based partly in some reality. There is some evidence that adolescents take more risks than other age groups.
Rebellious.
Did we say that one?
I don't know. Clueless.
Yeah, clueless.
One of the kind of nuances that the stereotype misses out is the context that risk-taking tends to take place in. So if you think about adolescent typical risk-taking, things like smoking and drinking alcohol and experimenting with drugs, dangerous driving, those kinds of risks don't tend to take place when the young person is on their own. It's normally when they're with their friends. And there's a lot of evidence from many different labs around the world that adolescents are particularly influenced by their peers.
I don't think I particularly take risks, although I have done small things like drunk a lot of ketchup before. I didn't know how much to take, so I didn't want to risk taking too little, too much, so I just took it all. And if I was on my own, I wouldn't have, because there would be no need to. I don't like ketchup.
So, for example, sticking with the example of driving risks, a classic experiment which has now been replicated several times by Larry Steinberg and his colleagues has shown that if you bring people into the lab, you get them to play a driving video game where you have to get around a circuit as quickly as possible. You find that actually, interestingly, the number of risks that different age groups take is around the same number when they're on their own, but if the participant has a couple of friends standing behind them, that significantly increases the number of driving risks adolescents take and young adults take under the age of 25, but it has no effect on the number of risks that adults over the age of 25 take. In terms of the experiments we've done in my lab, we often look at things like social influence, and one of the experiments we did looked at social influence on risk perception. So here we were asking participants to rate how risky they think different everyday situations are. So things like driving without a seatbelt, or crossing a street on a red light, or cycling without a helmet. The critical finding in this experiment was that young adolescents aged 12 to 14 are more influenced by people their own age, by other teenagers, and that wasn't true for any other age group. So children and older adolescents and adults are more likely to be influenced by adults than by teenagers.
My friends are very important to me because they're like, I see them almost every single day, and they make me feel safe as well. If I don't have my friends, sometimes I look a little bit lost.
One of the things that matters in adolescence is to be accepted by your peer group and not to be excluded by your peers. So we know from work by Kat Sebastian and other people that adolescents are hypersensitive to social exclusion.
People aren't being accepted for who they are, and they're being forced to change. And big things like social media affecting this, if you don't have social media, people are going to exclude you no matter who you are, even though they shouldn't. So people change who they are to fit in.
What it means is that they're going to pay more attention to their own peers than they are to adults. So if you're organising, say, a health campaign aimed at young people, what seems to matter most is changing social norms and educating young people themselves to run campaigns, anti-smoking or anti-bullying campaigns. That has a much bigger impact on young people's attitudes towards things like smoking and bullying than adults running the same kinds of campaigns. That absolutely fits with the new neuroscience showing that social influence has the biggest effect on adolescent decision-making and risk-taking, bigger than other influences. I think one thing I would have really appreciated knowing about during my teenage years was how the brain develops during adolescence, and how this is a period of life where everything is quite unstable, both in terms of your social world and your biology, your hormones and your brain. And that's a very natural, adaptive, developmental period where things are changing and where you'll come out the other end as an independent adult.
All right. So we see how important peers are during adolescence. And the chief determinant of popularity during adolescence, like we had talked about, are social skills. Acting appropriately in the eyes of peers, meeting the needs of others, being confident but not conceited. But adolescents, boys and girls, can be aggressive and popular at the same time, particularly with relational aggression. Remember, that's the non-physical aggression, but sort of the manipulating, verbal, starting rumors kind of aggression can be seen even among popular students. Boys are more physically aggressive than girls. And again, girls also act aggressively toward peers, but often more so in this relational aggression. And I thought this is a great quote. Unlike boys who tend to bully acquaintances or strangers, girls frequently attack within tightly knit friendship networks, making aggression harder to identify and intensifying the damage to the victims. Within the hidden culture of aggression, girls fight with body language and relationships instead of fists and knives. So it might be harder to see, but it's still there. And sometimes the damage can be just as deep, if not deeper, when a close friend kind of turns on you with their words and actions. Teenage relationships. Teens experience positive feelings during their interactions with parents. So that is good to know. Research does show that. Teenagers will enjoy a good laugh or a meal with their parents and have positive feelings about that, although those moments may be few. Most conflicts between teens and parents are based on rules, not surprisingly, and teens feel most upbeat when with their friends. In terms of different teenage pathways, at-risk teens tend to have prior emotional regulation difficulties, problems with executive functioning, right? Those planning, attention, kind of frontal lobe functions. They may have poor family relationships. We recommend an authoritative discipline style, right, with high levels of warmth, but also high levels of control and rules and standards. At-risk teens tend to have non-nurturing environments. They might have a school that kind of peer hierarchy that allows or promotes bullying. They might live in dangerous neighborhoods. But as developmentalists, we make a distinction between adolescent limited turmoil. This is antisocial, negative behavior that occurs just during the teenage years, which is not that uncommon compared to life course difficulties, which is antisocial behavior that continues into adult life. As we said, during the adolescence, there's more of this risk-taking, experimentation. This is also part of identity formation, trying out, am I the kind of person who skips school or doesn't listen to the rules or drives dangerously, right? These are all identities and experiences that adolescents may be trying out, and very often it is just limited to adolescence. Very few go on to continue to have these difficulties through the course of their life. Bullying and bullies' victims. Bullying is deliberate victimization of another adolescent or child. Ranges from verbal insults to social exclusion to physical assaults. Targets of bullies are those who are already near the bottom of the social ladder. They may be withdrawn, depressed, insecure, fearful, physically weak, socially immature. Having a best friend can protect someone from the negative effects of bullying. So just having one friend can be extraordinarily protective. Even if you're still being, that child is still being bullied or harassed, knowing they have a friend is emotionally and developmentally protective. But being bullied has been linked to serious and long-lasting problems, including depression, anger, anxiety, loneliness, anger, poor self-esteem. Bullies tend to be aggressive and hostile. They think of themselves as attractive and popular, even though they're actually disliked. Bullies run a greater risk of becoming delinquents, criminals, and substance abusers. There are quite a number of bully victims, which are children who are bullied, who then go on to bully others. Bullying and victimization reach a peak during the early adolescent years and then starts to decline. What about cyberspace peers? Here we are in the world of technology, and social networks are a growing aspect of adolescent social life. Adolescents might communicate with strangers or people they know using all sorts of social media. They can keep up with the latest trends. And it's really interesting to think about how these online social networks might actually change or replace more traditional forms of peer relationships. And there is a whole new area of study called cyber psychology. Might be something some of you are interested in, doing research on how this technology is affecting psychology, right? Thoughts, behaviors, emotions. And you can imagine that all of this technology has a huge impact on development. And so we're just starting to learn about and research the effect of cyber relationships. What about flourishing teens? Teens who do well through adolescence tend to have really good executive functioning, a mentor that they can look up to, close family relationships, friends who are pro-social, meaning doing positive activities, academic success, strong schools and communities, a passion or a special talent, and a strong religious faith and commitment. So making the world fit the teenage mind. Don't punish adolescents as if they were mentally just like adults. Remember, they're not. Their brain is not yet developed like an adult brain. So even though their bodies and physically they're starting to look like adults, we have to remember in some ways they're very much like adults, and in some ways they're still children, right? It's this in-between stage. Maybe don't taint people with a criminal record for minor teenage experimentation. Provide activities that capitalize on adolescents' strengths. And really interesting thought, how to change high schools to provide a better fit for the adolescent, right? Given all that we've talked about in terms of adolescents and their cognition and emotional and social development, is our traditional high school the best fit? And how could we maybe think about changing our educational system in a way that would be a more optimal fit for where adolescents are in their development? All right, thank you very much.